April 16th, 1945, 4 in the morning, Seelow Heights, 30 miles east of Berlin. Soviet artillery commander checks his watch one last time. Looks down the line at 9,000 guns positioned wheel to wheel along a 20-mile front, the largest concentration of artillery in human history. Every barrel loaded and aimed at German positions on the heights ahead. He raises his hand, waits for the second hand to reach 0 hour, drops his arm, and 9,000 guns fire simultaneously. The sound is like the earth splitting open. The flash lights up the predawn sky like a second sun. The shells scream overhead and begin landing on German trenches. That will cease to exist in the next 30 minutes. Behind the artillery line, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers wait in the darkness. The entire First Belorussian Front and First Ukrainian Front, more men than live in most countries. Armed with 6,250 tanks and 7,500 aircraft. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanding, he's been waiting 4 years for this moment. Waded through the disaster at Moscow in 1941. Waded through the agony of Stalingrad. Waded through Kursk and the long advance westward. Now he's 30 miles from Berlin, and nothing will stop him from taking Hitler's capital and ending this war. The barrage lasts 30 minutes. 1.2 million shells land on German positions. The most intensive bombardment in history. Trenches collapse, bunkers cave in. Men are buried alive or driven insane by the noise. When the shelling stops, the Soviet infantry advances expecting to walk through destroyed defenses. Instead, they run into German soldiers who somehow survived, who crawl out of collapsed bunkers and man their weapons and open fire. Because dying is certain, but surrender to the Soviets is worse. This is the Battle of Berlin. 16 days in April and May 1945, when the Soviet Red Army fought its way into Hitler's capital and destroyed the Third Reich in house-to-house combat that killed 500,000 people. When Hitler shot himself in his bunker rather than face capture. When German soldiers and civilians chose death over Soviet occupation. When the Nazis' racist ideology came home as the forces they considered subhuman conquered their capital and took revenge. For 4 years off extermination warfare on the Eastern Front. The road to Berlin starts 1,000 miles east in January 1945 when the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, smashing through German defensive lines in Poland, advancing 300 miles in 3 weeks. Reaching the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin by early February. The advance is so fast that Soviet supply lines can't keep up. Zhukov's tanks are running on captured German fuel. His soldiers are eating captured German food. The offensive pauses at the Oder to consolidate and prepare for the final assault on Berlin. Stalin is obsessed with taking Berlin before the Western Allies. He knows the Americans and British are advancing from the West, knows that whoever captures Berlin will control post-war Germany. He orders Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev to prepare for maximum speed assault on the capital regardless of casualties. Take Berlin by May 1st or face consequences. Stalin doesn't specify what consequences, but everyone knows Stalin's track record with commanders who disappoint him. Hitler is in Berlin, living in the Vorbunker under the Reich Chancellery Garden. 30 feet of concrete and earth separating him from reality. He's surrounded by maps showing armies that no longer exist, issuing orders to divisions that were destroyed weeks ago, raging about betrayal and weakness while the city burns around him. He's 56 years old, but looks 70. His left hand shakes uncontrollably from Parkinson's. He shuffles when he walks. He's addicted to medications his quack doctor injects daily. He's physically and mentally deteriorating, but still commands absolute authority over what remains of Nazi Germany. The German forces defending Berlin are scraped together from remnants. Army Group Vistula under General Gotthold Heinrici has maybe 1 million men on paper. in reality closer to 750,000 combat-effective soldiers. Many are teenagers from the Hitler Youth or old men from the Volkssturm militia, armed with obsolete weapons and a few days of training, positioned against 2.5 million battle-hardened Soviet troops who've been fighting since 1941. The math doesn't work, but Hitler insists Berlin will be defended to the last bullet. Every building will become a fortress. Every street will be contested. National Socialism will die fighting rather than surrender. Heinrici is professional soldier, not Nazi fanatic. He knows Berlin can't be held, knows the defense will just create pointless casualties. But refusing Hitler's orders means execution. He positions his forces at Seelow Heights, hoping to delay the Soviets long enough that maybe the Western Allies will reach Berlin first. Maybe the Americans will be more reasonable occupiers than the Soviets, who have 4 years of German atrocities to avenge. April 16, 1945. The Soviet assault on Seelow Heights begins with that massive artillery barrage. Then 143 searchlights turn on simultaneously, pointing at the German positions. The idea is to blind the defenders with the lights. The execution is disaster because morning fog reflects the light back at the Soviet troops. The attackers are blinded while defenders can see perfectly. Soviet infantry advances into German machine gun fire that cuts them down in rows. The attack bogs down immediately. Zhukov is watching from an observation post. Realizes the attack is failing. His plan called for breakthrough in hours. Instead, his troops are dying in thousands and barely gaining ground. He's under enormous pressure from Stalin to take Berlin quickly. He makes desperate decision. Commits his tank reserves immediately, instead of waiting for infantry to create breakthrough. Sends armor up the heights into German anti-tank positions. The tanks are destroyed in dozens, but sheer weight of numbers eventually overwhelms the defenders. 3 days of brutal fighting at Seelow Heights costs the Soviets 30,000 dead and 700 tanks destroyed. Costs the Germans their last effective defensive line before Berlin. Heinrich's forces fall back toward the city. The German army is disintegrating. Soldiers are deserting in thousands. SS execution squads hang deserters from lampposts with signs reading, "I was too cowardly to fight." The terror keeps some units fighting, but accelerates collapse of others. By April 20th, Soviet forces are entering Berlin's suburbs. April 20th, 1945. Hitler's 56th birthday, the last birthday he'll celebrate. Soviet shells are landing in the government district. The bunker shakes with each impact. Hitler's staff urges him to leave Berlin while escape is still possible. Fly south to Bavaria, where loyal SS divisions can protect him. Hitler refuses. He'll stay in Berlin and lead the defense personally. His commanders know this means he's planning suicide, but nobody says it directly. The battle for Berlin proper begins. April 21st, when Soviet forces attack from 3 directions. Zhukov's first Belorussian Front from the east. Konev's first Ukrainian Front from the south. Rokossovsky's second Belorussian Front from the north. The pincers are closing around the city. German forces in Berlin number maybe 45,000 regular troops plus 40,000 Volkssturm. They're facing 500,000 Soviet soldiers with overwhelming artillery and air support. The Soviets advance block by block. Building by building, the fighting is savage. German soldiers and Hitler Youth defend from fortified buildings. Soviet troops blast through walls with artillery, use flamethrowers to burn out defenders, advance through cellars and sewers. The city becomes a 3-dimensional battlefield where combat happens simultaneously on rooftops, ground floors, and underground, where death comes from any direction and survival is random chance. The civilian population of Berlin still numbers about 2.5 million. They're trapped in cellars while the battle rages overhead. No electricity, no running water, limited food. artillery shells and bombs collapsing buildings randomly. The civilians are terrified of the Soviet troops. Nazi propaganda for 4 years described Russian soldiers as subhuman barbarians who rape and murder. The propaganda was projection, describing what Germans did in Russia. But now the chickens are coming home. Soviet soldiers are taking revenge for German atrocities. Rape and murder of German civilians is widespread, though the scale is debated by historians. April 23rd, Soviet forces complete the encirclement of Berlin. The city is surrounded. No escape possible. German forces outside the city attempt breakout attacks to relieve the garrison, but these are futile. The Soviet ring is too strong. Berlin is isolated and dying. Hitler in his bunker still issues orders for counterattacks by armies that don't exist. His maps show unit positions that are fantasy. His staff nods and takes notes and quietly ignores the orders. The Soviet advance toward the city center accelerates. They're fighting toward the Reichstag building, which Stalin designated as symbolic objective. Whoever plants the Soviet flag on the Reichstag wins the race to Berlin. Zhukov and Konev are competing for the honor. Their troops are taking unnecessary casualties in the rush to be first. Street fighting in Berlin kills 20,000 Soviet soldiers every day. The butcher's bill is staggering, but Stalin doesn't care about casualties. Only about speed. April 28th, Soviet forces reach the Lentveer Canal, 2 blocks from the Reichstag. They're so close that Hitler can hear the gunfire from his bunker. Berlin is in flames. The sky is orange from fires burning across the city. Soviet artillery is shelling the government quarter continuously. Shells are landing on the Chancellery Garden above the bunker. Dirt rains down on Hitler and his staff with each impact. The end is obviously near. Hitler's mental state deteriorates completely in final days. He rages about betrayal. Specifically blames Göring for trying to negotiate surrender and Himmler for secretly contacting the Western Allies. Both men are declared traitors. Hitler orders their arrests and executions, though the orders can't be carried out. He marries his longtime mistress Eva Braun on April 29th. The wedding ceremony in the bunker is surreal. Artillery shells exploding overhead while a minor official performs the marriage rites. April 29th. Hitler dictates his political testament, blames everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. The Jews, the generals, the German people who weren't strong enough. He expels Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party. Names Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. Orders Dönitz to continue fighting. The testament is delusional and bitter. Takes no responsibility. Shows no remorse. Hitler has learned nothing. The man who started a war that killed 60 million people spends his final hours blaming others. April 30th, 1945. Afternoon. Soviet forces are fighting in the streets around the Chancellery. They're 300 meters from the bunker entrance. Hitler decides it's time. He says goodbye to his staff. Retreats to his private room with Eva Braun. Around 3:30 p.m., he shoots himself in the head with his Walther pistol, while Eva takes cyanide. Their bodies are carried up to the Chancellery Garden, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline. Burned as Soviet shells explode nearby, the bodies burn for hours, but don't completely cremate. Charred remains are buried in a shallow grave. Hitler's death doesn't end the battle. Admiral Dönitz assumes power, orders continued resistance. But most German commanders in Berlin realize fighting is pointless. General Helmuth Weidling, commanding the Berlin defense area, negotiates surrender, tries to contact the Soviet command. The fighting continues while surrender negotiations proceed because nobody trusts the other side to honor any agreement. May 1st. Soviet soldiers reach the Reichstag. The building is defended by about 2,000 German troops who fortified it heavily. The Soviets attack with flamethrowers and grenades, fight floor by floor, room by room. The battle for the Reichstag lasts through the night. Finally, on May 2nd, Soviet soldiers reach the roof. Red Army Sergeant Meliton Kantaria plants the Soviet flag on the dome. The photograph of the flag raising becomes iconic image of Soviet victory, though the actual flag raising happened after the building was secured. May 2nd, 1945. General Weidling officially surrenders the Berlin garrison. 134,000 German soldiers lay down their weapons. The battle is over. Berlin is rubble. The city that Hitler built to last 1,000 years survived 12 years of Nazi rule and 16 days of Soviet assault. 125,000 civilians dead. 80,000 German soldiers dead. 81,000 Soviet soldiers dead. The final butcher's bill for the Battle of Berlin approaches 300,000 killed, plus 500,000 wounded. The city is destroyed. Entire neighborhoods are leveled. Fires burn for days. Corpses lie in the streets unburied. The smell is overwhelming. Soviet soldiers loot systematically. Rape is widespread. German civilians hide in cellars. The occupation is brutal, though not as brutal as German occupation of Soviet cities. The Soviets are taking revenge, but showing more restraint than Germans showed in Russia. This is cold comfort to victims, but it's reality. Stalin arrives in Berlin in early May, inspects the ruins, visits Hitler's bunker, sees the room where Hitler died. The charred remains haven't been found yet. Stalin orders thorough search. Soviet intelligence eventually finds Hitler's partial remains, extracts the dental records, confirms identity through Hitler's dentist, keeps the discovery secret for decades. Publicly, the Soviets claim Hitler escaped to spread conspiracy theories and embarrass the West. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally to all Allied powers. The war in Europe is over. Soviet victory in Berlin secured the end, but cost an ocean of blood. Stalin's insistence on speed and symbolic victory killed tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers unnecessarily. The same commanders who saved Russia in 1941-43 through skill and determination became butchers in 1945 because Stalin demanded Berlin before the Americans arrived. The question historians debate is whether Berlin needed to be taken by assault, whether the city could have been surrounded and starved into surrender with fewer casualties. The answer is probably yes militarily, but no politically. Stalin needed visible victory in Hitler's capital, needed the photographs of Soviet flags on the Reichstag, needed to demonstrate Soviet power to the Western Allies before post-war negotiations. The strategic calculation was political, not military, and the price was paid in soldiers' lives. The German defense of Berlin was pointless militarily. Every general knew the war was lost weeks before the battle started. Defending the city just created civilian casualties and destroyed infrastructure that Germans would need after the war. But Nazi ideology demanded fight to the finish. The regime that started total war got total war in return. The capital that cheered Hitler's victories in 1940 burned in 1945. The civilians who benefited from plunder of occupied Europe starved in rubble of their city. The moral responsibility for the Battle of Berlin's destruction rests entirely with Hitler and Nazi leadership who started the war, who refused to surrender when defeat was certain, who ordered fanatical defense that achieved nothing except multiplying casualties. Hitler's suicide in the bunker was cowardice, not heroism. Shooting himself rather than facing consequences of his actions, leaving his people to suffer occupation and defeat while he escaped through death. The Soviet soldiers who fought in Berlin were motivated by revenge for German atrocities in Russia. They'd seen the destroyed cities, the mass graves, the concentration camps. They knew what Germans did, and they wanted payback. The conduct of some Soviet soldiers was criminal, but the impulse was understandable given what they'd experienced. 4 years of German extermination warfare produced predictable result when the victims conquered the aggressor's capital. The civilians trapped in Berlin during the battle were victims of the regime they supported or tolerated. Not all Germans were Nazis, but enough supported Hitler that he conquered most of Europe. The civilians who died in Berlin in April 1945 were paying the price for their government's crimes. This doesn't justify rape or murder, but it explains why Soviet soldiers felt limited sympathy for German suffering. The Battle of Berlin ended World War II in Europe, but started the Cold War. Soviet occupation of Berlin and division of Germany into occupation zones led directly to decades of confrontation. The battle that finished one war planted seeds for the next, though fortunately the Cold War stayed cold and didn't produce another. Battle of Berlin. Remember the Battle of Berlin, not as glorious Soviet victory or tragic German defeat, but as final act of catastrophic war that Germany started and lost. The battle was inevitable consequence of Hitler's aggression and refusal to surrender. The casualties were necessary price for ending Nazi regime that would have continued murdering millions if allowed to survive. The suffering was terrible, but less than suffering Nazi Germany caused across Europe. Remember the Soviet soldiers who died taking Berlin? They were liberating Europe from fascism, even if some conducted themselves criminally. They'd fought from Moscow to Berlin and earned their victory even if Stalin's demands made it unnecessarily costly. Without their sacrifice and battles from Stalingrad through Berlin, the Nazi regime might have survived years longer, causing incalculable additional suffering. Remember, the German soldiers who died defending the indefensible. Many were kids from the Hitler Youth or old men from the Volkssturm who had no choice about fighting. They were victims of the regime as much as soldiers of it. Their deaths in Berlin's ruins were pointless sacrifice to Nazi ideology that valued death over surrender. Their commanders who ordered hopeless defense while planning escape were criminals who should have surrendered to save lives. Remember, the civilians who died in Berlin's cellars, crushed by collapsed buildings, killed by artillery, raped and murdered by soldiers. They were victims of the war their government started, but also participants in the regime that started it. Their suffering was terrible, but it was fraction of suffering Germans inflicted on occupied Europe. The moral accounting of World War II doesn't balance, but it's clear who bore primary responsibility. This is the Battle of Berlin. April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. 16 days when the Soviet Red Army destroyed the Third Reich's capital and ended World War II in Europe. When 500,000 people died in street fighting and artillery bombardments. When Hitler shot himself rather than face defeat. When the war that started with German troops marching into Poland in 1939 ended with Soviet troops raising their flag over the Reichstag. When Nazi Germany's racist ideology came home, as the forces they considered subhuman conquered their capital and took revenge for 4 years of genocide and extermination. Warfare.